So what's Dershowitz's argument then? Well, again, this paper written 2004, really shortly after revelations about some of the practices in U.S. prisons in Afghanistan and Iraq had started to come to light. And he argues, look, given that we currently, that is in 2004, torture, we're tortured in the past, at least we've had agents of other governments doing it, and likely will torture in the future. We have three policy options moving forward. First policy option, we can modify our laws to require a mechanism like warrants, whereby when we have a case where it looks important to the national interest of saving lives of innocent people, to torture, that case gets submitted for judicial review. If judicial review approves, then that person will get tortured. Second option, allow the current, what he calls hypocritical practice to continue. So continue torturing, kind of under the radar and black sites in ways that has pretty limited accountability and that has an unclear chain of command associated with it, affects an untold number of people, and so on. Or three, effectively ban torture. And he's going to want to argue for that first option. He's going to want to conclude that the best policy moving forward, the one that makes the most sense given the real world, is that first policy, number one. He's going to argue that number one is preferable because it's going to provide a significant improvement on the current situation, because it's going to reduce and maybe even eliminate torture, though usually he talks in terms of reducing, creating only necessary torture. It's going to increase the visibility of these practices. There will no longer be any covert hiding of these practices, and it'll introduce a standard democratic mechanism of accountability to prevent the abuse of this kind of procedure. And so he thinks number one, by far the best. But to get to that, he's going to argue against the other two positions. So what are his arguments against these other two policy stances moving forward? Well, the second stance, right, the one where we just keep doing things the way we are. He says, look, we can't allow the current off-the-books practice to continue. It creates more torture than necessary, violates democratic values of visibility and oversight, and it's hypocritical. Look, we pretend that we're not torturing. We're torturing. Other governments know we're torturing. It gets exposed in the popular press, and we just look like liars and hypocrites. We have these democratic values about how governance should occur, and those values say that especially acts like this should have visibility. People should know when the government does things like this, and oversight. There should be some mechanism that makes sure that these kinds of activities aren't abused, aren't excessive, and so on. And he thinks that by doing that, the net impact of that will be that there'll be clear-cut lines of command, there'll be clear-cut mechanisms of approval and disapproval of oversight, and hence the number of cases of torture he thinks is very likely to go down. So we stay with option two. We're hypocrites. We violate our own democratic values for good governance, of visibility and oversight, and we torture more than is absolutely necessary to accomplish any possible goals we might have with regard to the reduction of terrorism. So that's his argument against two. What about his argument against the third option, which is the sort of default option, the option that most countries in the world have agreed to in numerous treaties that ban torture? His response to this position is to argue that, look, this would be great I myself don't like torture, don't think it's morally acceptable. Nevertheless, in the real world, where not everybody agrees with me, where these things occur, any attempt to effectively ban torture is only going to give rise to these hypocritical, off the books practices that erupt at various points in time. And he thinks there are a couple of reasons to suppose that that's true, that there'll never be a true, long lasting, effective ban on torture. One is that he thinks lots of governments do it now and have done it in the past. So there's a long history suggesting that it's a practice that emerges repeatedly in governance. And then I think importantly, he offers up this thought experiment. And he talks about when he was in Israel and he was trying to advocate for getting rid of torture in Israel, that people would constantly bring up this case as an example. And the force of the example seemed to be to suggest that, in fact, no, under certain circumstances, it's morally permissible to engage in acts of torture. And so he thinks there's at least a reasonably large population out there who's moved by this argument. Then there'll always be some political impetus, at least at certain points of fear and threat and so on, to go to the off-the-books practice of torture if we maintain this attempt to continue to ban torture outright. And so 2 and 3, he claims, just aren't viable real-world policies. They just aren't going to work. And that leaves us with 1. And so he thinks, look, we've just got to sort of face up to the political realities of things. We've got to recognize that there are situations that lots of people think someone is morally justified, or at least not morally blameworthy if they torture. And we've got to try and maximize, our other values, like the values of good democratic governments, and minimize the negative aspects of this phenomenon if we recognize it as, he suggests, as it is, inevitable. So what is this case that he thinks prevents us from ever getting enough permanent consensus against using torture in all circumstances to really be able to effectively ban torture always? Well, he describes it for us on page 259. So the ticking bomb case refers to variations on a scenario that has been discussed by many philosophers, including Michael Walzer, a political philosopher who's written, for instance, on the philosophy of war, Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist French philosopher, and Jeremy Bentham, who we'll recognize as one of the 3 big original utilitarian thinkers. And he tells us the current variation on the classic ticking bomb case involves the following. So a government organization captures a terrorist. Clear-cut, strong, say irrefutable evidence that the terrorist has the important information about an imminent use of weapons of mass destruction, a nuclear device, a chemical or a biological device, something that's going to result in the death and injury of thousands of civilians. Got this terrorist, knows the terrorist has that information about this imminent terrorist event. Terrorist refuses to divulge that information, and then the intuition that this case is supposed to elicit in us is, if we had to torture this person to get that information and then save those thousands of people, we wouldn't be morally blameworthy. We wouldn't be doing something that was bad, even if it wasn't morally praiseworthy. And this scenario has had a lot of prominence in thinking in the United States and other places. He mentions how common a scenario was in Israel. It's basically the premise of 24, lots of other different movies that have come out since 9/11. And so he says, look, there is this thought experiment. This thought experiment, for at least a significant number of individuals, does generate this intuition that, yes, you'd be right, or at least not morally blameworthy, if you tortured that terrorist to save those thousands of people.